It's the Kyle Hyman Show on Redeemer Radio.
This is Kyle Hyman, and joining us up in our South Bend studio is Dr. Therese Cory, who has been named a member of the Pontifical Academy of St Thomas Aquinas by Pope Francis. Thanks for being here, Dr. Cory.
Thanks for having me, Kyle.
This is so exciting, and also just learning about this and that there's 50 people that are on this lifetime appointment as Pontifical Academy is just fascinating to me. But what attracted you to studying St. Thomas Aquinas in the first place?
Well, this all goes back to my freshman year at Ave Maria College. I was a theology and classics major, and in my first theology class, we read a ton of Thomas Aquinas, and I was just completely hooked by the fact that he's so systematic. He has this unified vision of truth that integrates philosophical and theological questions. And so you can go and look through his writings for an answer to all sorts of the fundamental questions that Catholics have about their faith, that human beings have about reality. And I just really loved the way that he put it all together into a single picture. And I just knew I wanted to keep working on him.
How much of an influence of Catholic Church's teachings and understanding of the faith came from Aquinas?
Well, he was a very influential figure in the history of Catholic thought. I mean, now, especially since the end of the 19th century, when Pope Leo XIII emphasized Thomistic philosophy and theology as a tradition that's particularly important to Catholic thinking, he's received a lot more study, a lot more attention than a lot of other thinkers in the Catholic tradition. So I would say he's hugely influential, especially in 20th century Catholic philosophy and theology. But it's also the case that the way that he sets up some problems, it's not just him working by himself in the 13th century. He's part of a larger tradition of scholastic thought that includes people like Albert the Great and Duns Scotus. But the discussions and conversations that he helped shape in scholasticism and the way that Augustine and Aristotle get integrated into Catholic thinking about the human person, about the Trinity, about Christology, those topics all end up having a huge influence on an ongoing tradition of Catholic thought. So it's kind of interesting. You can see, even if you read the Catholic Catechism today, you can find not just explicit quotes of Thomas Aquinas, but you can also find a lot of implicit references where there's formulations that we've come to use to talk about certain things. So if you read the passages on the beatific vision of God in the afterlife, some of the language that the Catechism uses doesn't reference Aquinas, but is directly taken out of Aquinas' writings.
And how did he get so smart that we're still studying him 745 years after his death?
Well, he seems to have been kind of a prodigy, actually, during his lifetime. And that wasn't something that was immediately obvious to a lot of people. So we have some stories about his life as a student. And we know that the other students, they made fun of him in the class because they thought that he was slow. And they called him the dumb ox.
Right.
And his teacher, Albert the Great, was supposed to have recognized, despite the silence of this student who was just sitting in the corner not saying anything, and in conversation with him, he was able to recognize that this was a mind that was truly great. And certainly he's one of the most important figures of the medieval period. And one of the things I think that's particularly important about, one of the talents that he doesn't come out of nowhere. I mean, no great thinker just comes out of nowhere, but he's an incredible synthesizer. And so he's at a point in the history of Western thought where there's a kind of confluence of different traditions coming together. You have Augustinianism, Pseudo-Dionysius, a kind of Neoplatonic tradition. And then you also have Aristotle, who's being newly translated at the time. You have all of this new philosophical ideas coming out of the Muslim world that are being translated into Latin and reaching the University of Paris. And he's somebody who's really excited about bringing all of those different strands together and taking the best of all of these different traditions and trying to make something new with them.
So can you give us an example of something that has had an impact on our lives today that came from St. Thomas Aquinas?
So I think one of the really important elements in Catholic thought today is an emphasis on the goodness of the human body. So if we sort of carve up some different philosophical theories here, one popular way of thinking about embodiment in the human body in, say, the Platonic tradition was to see the body as being something like a kind of instrument that's associated with the real you. And the body is just a kind of tool that most often drags us down, but it's really something that we have to transcend and get past. And beatitude consists in leaving the body behind and really living the life of the mind. And Aquinas is one of the big figures in the development of Western thinking on the goodness of the body and the goodness of being a bodily creature. So that, we're not angels that are trapped in a material substance that's weighing us down. In fact, we're the kind of mind that God has given a bodily existence to that really helps us come to know and glorify him in the particular way that we can as bodily creatures. And so one of the things that Aquinas, I think, is really interesting for is the emphasis that he places on the resurrection of the body in his theology as being something that's not just a kind of theological add-on where we say, well, yeah, we know we have this promise from Revelation, but we don't really know why. He wants to say, no, there's something about human beings that are incomplete unless we're living this fully bodily existence. And so it's actually something that God promises us to complete us in the resurrection, to bring us back to wholeness, which we would not have without that. And so I think that this sort of goodness of the material creation and the sort of appreciation that we have for our embodied existence, that's something that Aquinas played a significant role in.
Sure. So what does the Pontifical Academy on St. Thomas Aquinas do that you've been appointed to?
Yeah, so a Pontifical Academy is basically something like a think tank. So generally, there are these academies, and there's a trend from that began in the 19th century for governments to develop national academies where they would bring together scholars who would just be doing work on particular areas, so science or philosophy or something like that. And so this is something that Leo XIII did at the end of the 19th century. He founded these pontifical academies, and they're basically like groups of scholars in a particular area who just get together and do their scholarly thing, but at the service of the church. So this is a little bit different from, say, a pontifical commission, which is organized to study a particular problem within a specific time frame. So the pontifical academies are set up so that we can just do our ordinary scholarly work, but do it in a more collaborative way, meeting once a year, sharing the results of our research. And one of the things that the Pontifical Academy of St. Thomas has wanted to do in the past, has really been recently developing, is to try and align the topics of our annual meetings with the kind of thematic priorities that Pope Francis is exemplifying in his writing or in the writings of the other pontifical bodies. So the topic this past summer for our annual meeting was salvation. That was a really great topic for philosophers and theologians to talk about together. It's not a topic that I get to think about very much as a philosopher. And so it was kind of exciting to be able to bring my philosophical tools to bear on this deeply theological question and to have to learn from theologians who are working on this. So the idea was to have the theme be centered around the problem of salvation, which comes from Placuit Deo, which is a recent document that was issued talking about salvation.
So then what is the outcome of that? Do you publish your findings at the end of all this?
Yes. So the results of every annual meeting get published in a proceedings volume. Okay. So that provides a kind of working document as a result of the meeting. But we're also thinking about other ways that we can disseminate that information. So now we have so many different, media that we could be disseminating some of that information on. So we might want in the future to rethink some of the traditional ways of communicating the results of the meeting. So
are you making new discoveries of interpretations of St. Thomas Aquinas' writings, or is it more the application of, we always knew that he taught this, and here's something that is happening in today's society, and we're applying it to today's standards?
Right. So, yeah, great question. So we've got a bunch of different things that scholars working on St. Thomas can do that are really new ways of approaching him. So we know all of his works. We have them available. So it's not like we're going to discover any new texts.
Right.
They've been very thoroughly read. But since he's a thinker who's been read for so many centuries, what happens as a result of that, I mean, there's a benefit because he's so well known, but there can be a tendency to start reading his works, like those of any famous author, through the lens of whatever problems or frameworks or conceptual approaches that are prominent at the time of the reader. So I think what we've become accustomed to now is a kind of early modern or modern reading of Aquinas that puts him in conversation with later thinkers like Descartes and Locke and Kant, and really looks to him to be answering questions that they're asking. And that's fine. There's a lot of interesting developments that came out of that. But at the same time, I think we've also kind of lost some of the original framework for thinking about how he's approaching the problems himself. Because, philosophical concepts change and we lose insights that we've had in the past. And so one of the things that I work on a lot in my research on Aquinas is to try to recover some of those frameworks for thinking about the mind and the human person, and to think about how did that look like to him before some of the channels were dug by later philosophers that our thought just tends to naturally flow into? And are there new things we can learn about the human mind and new insights we can recover by trying to recover his original vision? So one example of that would be thinking about what knowing is exactly in Aquinas. This is the topic of a book that I'm working on right now. And we have this tendency now to think about knowing in terms of connecting up a subject and an object, a mind and a world. And there's all sorts of philosophical problems that come up from that. But if we go back to Aquinas and we try to recover his thought in its original context, we can see that he thinks more about knowing in terms of a kind of transformation of the human person. So something happens to you. There's a change that happens to you. There's a way that you grow as a human being in the very act of accomplishing an insight. When you understand a mathematical problem, or you've been studying botany for this whole time and now you really get the life of an oak tree. And those moments are actually moments that are transformative of the human person. So I think that's a really important insight he has to offer us. And that's something I'm trying to recover.
Well, it's exciting that you're on this committee. Also, another professor from Notre Dame. So the two of you, I imagine, have a lot to talk about.
Yes, exactly. So my colleague, John OCallaghan, he's been on the Academy longer than I have. And so it's been really great to talk to him about the work that's been going on. And I know that his work has also been inspired by the work of the Academy and the writings of Pope Francis. And so he's working on a book right now on Aquinas on mercy, which I'm really excited about. And so we'll see how that turns out.
Very cool. Well, where can people find more about what you're up to, books you've written, find out more about St. Thomas Aquinas? Where would you like to send people?
So all that information is on my faculty page at Notre Dame. So if you Google my name and Notre Dame, then the faculty page comes up and has links to a bunch of different publications. And, if people want to know more about Thomas Aquinas and just get an introduction, I also want to mention that the Dominicans of the Eastern Province have just started this really exciting new endeavor called Aquinas 101. So if you Google that, if you're looking for how do I dive into Aquinas, where do I start? And they've got all these great little videos that they've made, and they're always adding more. So that is a fantastic place to start if you're interested in learning more about Thomas Aquinas.
All right. I will check that out, and I'll put links to that, including your faculty page on our show notes. So thank you so much, Dr. Therese Cory, for sharing a little about St. Thomas Aquinas with us. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Kyle.